This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger is joined by Representative Blake Moore, who represents Utah's 1st congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. They discuss Representative Moore's views on the upcoming presidential election, congressional priorities and budget challenges, entitlement reform, national security and economic policies, the war in Ukraine and global security, and much more.
Congressman Blake Moore, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be in, an honor to be on.
Well, we love having you involved in Reagan Institute programming and glad that you're on Reaganism with us. It's a pivotal time in the country. We're chatting just before the presidential election coming up next week. By the time this podcast published, Americans would have voted and probably waiting for the results on the election outcome. You're sitting in Utah. Of course, you represent the 1st congressional district out there. I imagine the focus, anticipation around the election perhaps is not quite what it's like in Washington, D.C., but I'm sure your constituents are still seized by what's to play out next week.
Right. So every single district kind of has a different experience during this time. But I've been through. My first election was 2020, right? But I wasn't sitting as a member of Congress during it, and we went through midterms, and a lot of things to learn from that. This is my first time that there's a presidential election. Obviously, the hype and the rhetoric, it's significant, and I think people really enjoy sitting back on Tuesday night, sort of watching to see the way things are going to play out. We're doing a lot more early voting as a nation now, so that has a its own little nuance of interest that comes with that. My race isn't very popular. There's very little money spent. There's millions and millions of dollars being spent not too far from here,
yes.
Right? That just become the battleground states, and there's fewer and fewer of those. So it's ever changing, and we've got big policy and big things that are in our nation that we need to actually be working on, and hopefully as soon as we get through this election cycle, we can get back, accomplish something during the lame duck, and then see what happens for the 119th Congress.
Well, you're right to focus on what the country needs to do. It's a lot pending, and of course, it's not just the presidential election, but the House is in the balance. That is, who's going to control the House of Representatives, as well as the United States Senate. So there's a lot that's going to play out, and then we'll determine what that political and policy agenda will look like as we move into with new president in January of 2025.
Right. New president.
No matter what. You have just a great background. It's super interesting what you did prior to coming to the Congress and then what you've done in Congress. We got to know each other when you first came in to the Congress. You're working on the Armed Services Committee, and now you had to leave that because you were pulled into the worlds of the Ways and Means Committee, one of the most prestigious and consequential committees in the U.S. Congress. Although here at the Reagan Institute, we have our own bias towards the Armed Services Committee, so we forgive you for leaving that committee. And one of the things that you've done that I've noticed looking at your record is really trying to have some continuity between focusing on U.S. foreign policy and national security interests from your time when you entered the Congress and Armed Services, even through the Ways and Means Committee, which traditionally focuses on domestic policy. Of course, its most important duty, I think, it's charged with is setting revenue, the tax policy, as well as trade policy. Give us a little perspective on where you focused this current Congress and how you're thinking. I think it's fair to say we expect you to be reelected and for the next Congress.
One of the main reasons that I wanted to be on Ways and Means is because my, support of our armed services. So why leave armed services if that's the case? We have a crowding out effect going on. Our budgets are split into 3 main categories, right? Defense spending, non-defense discretionary, so defense discretionary, non-defense discretionary, and mandatory. Ways and Means handles the lion's share of the mandatory spending. That side of the budget, that side of the ledger, grows at a significantly higher clip than our defense or our non-defense discretionary. Of course, the discretionary gets all the blame because that's just what we vote on each year. And so that's, disingenuous politicians, that's what they want to focus on. And while all of a sudden this 75% of the budget is going here growing wildly out of control. And that is the biggest threat for us to be able to properly, put our military and our national security in the right focus. And so that's something that I care deeply about. Now, it's very difficult to change that. I think you have to have the right political environment to be able to address some of these things. But that's a big goal of mine. But we also, trade policy puts us in stronger positions than otherwise. Tax policy with a strong economy. I mean, there's going to be, right now we have hotspots and conflicts all over the globe, more than we should be having. But, right, economic indicators and economic, influence is still the most important aspect in global security and making sure that the U.S. is leading the charge there. And so, I look at national security. There's energy as a national security issue, making sure that we have strong economic growth as a national security issue, and then, of course, making sure we can fund the right programs and our service members that they can have, what they need to be able to thrive in their own positions, having that. So it's an all-encompassing approach.
It's a great set of points. I kind of want to drill down on one point you made, and this really goes to this kind of economic health and American national security. They're hand in hand. You don't get one without the other. And your breakdown of the federal budget, we get all wrapped around the axle on discretionary spending, on whether or not we have appropriations bills, but it increasingly year over year, that's almost a sideshow, because when you think about government spending, as you noted, it's like 75% that's on autopilot in the mandatory spending side of the House, which of course the Ways and Means Committee, on which you sit, really is the committee that I guess is most able to address the autopilot spending, is the way I think of it. But you did say, Congressman Moore, that it really depends on the environment, and you need to have kind of like-minded, as I assume what you meant, members of Congress and also those in the Senate Finance Committee to think about it the same way. And one of the things we've seen is almost the opposite, and I'd love your reaction to this, that there seems to be a bipartisan approach that we don't want to touch the entitlement spending. We don't want to touch the mandatory spending. I think it was one of the only moments in President Biden's, joint session of Congress where he had, both sides of the aisle stand up and applaud, where he said something to the effect of, we're not going to touch entitlements. So that does not portend, I think, good things for those who want to see government spending and the debt tackled and addressed. What's your reaction to that? Do you see it the same way?
So what you see, what's going on underneath all of the kumbaya nature of making sure that we have a funded Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security programs is the constant fear of getting attacked politically if you do anything on this front. And it comes from all sides. But, in the State of the Union address, you can start to see it like, hey, I want to make sure Republicans don't want to cut your Social Security. And then President Trump will come in, hey, I want to make sure Republicans don't want to cut your Social Security. And we're sitting there on Ways and Means like, wait a minute. These are big spending items. We have to reform them. We are a different nation than we were in 1935. Or when, my idol, President Reagan sat down with Tip O'Neill and did the right thing for the country and making the compromise and making it work. Like we're a far cry from that right now, because everything gets inflamed politically so much, and the ads almost write themselves, and then it's a balance of power issue and this and that. So yeah, I see it the same way you do, but the underlying issue is that there's a political, everybody's scared politically. That doesn't mean that the desire is not there to make sure. Social Security, these are back of the napkin type of fixes, right? You got an age issue you got to deal with. You got a means test issue you got to deal with. You got to make sure that we're not overly, the benefits, are they meeting what the need is? Is there a reduction in benefits, but is there also an increase in caps, on FICA caps? Like, there's all those things that have to play into it. There's probably a little bit of everything that goes and fixes that. We've been super myopic by not going with George W. Bush's plan, on growing the trust funds at a more market-based rate. My goodness, that is not a type of thoughtful, futuristic approach on serving those that are going to need this program one day. Well, let's just let it grow in a very low yield government account. My goodness. Like
so that's what you're referring to is the trust funds that are underfunded and not going to keep pace, that make people who demagogue this issue, saying, hey, we're running out of money and you're not going to get your fair share of what you put into Social Security. There's actually a fix, which is put the money in.
We're going to privatize it. No, it's not privatization.
Yeah.
We live in a privatized. Everybody's 401ks are private. Like, they're all growing at the right rate, right? And we need to do that for the people that need to benefit from this program.
One more question on this, and then we'll jump out to some of the other items that you've been working on in the Congress, and no doubt you'll want to continue working on. So you kind of captured how the politics almost hijacked the common sense approach to dealing with some of these issues. But when the camera lights are off and the press conferences are not taking place, and you sit back with your colleagues on your side of the aisle, on the Republican side, and Democrats, I mean, do you actually see people who are like, yeah, we could get this done? If somebody crowded out the politics, like, there's agreement across the aisle and within the Republican conference to move this forward.
Well, one issue is that those lights never dim with social media. So social media makes it basically it's ubiquitous that the press conference is always on. But that aside, you've got groups like the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, of which I've been a member of since the get-go. It's kind of led by a really strong group with the Committee for Responsible Federal Budgeting. That's a group that meets in a sincere way to identify Republican and Democrat. So this is a bipartisan group. Hey, we've got issues here, and it has to be a little bit of everything. The one thing that we've really pushed for this year, it's not going to see the light of day on the House floor or the Senate floor, unfortunately, but we at least moved it out of committee, and that gives me some hope that we can get it done in the next few years, is the Fiscal Commission Act. It's like a Greenspan Commission or a Simpson-Bowles, but it forces us to eventually vote on the recommendations. It doesn't just get to be advisory. It actually forces us to take action. And that's where I see some serious work going on.
And even Simpson-Bowles, which seemed to be that was the last time we had a commission like that. I believe that that failed, and we ended up going to sequestration. So whatever the consequence was supposed to be, that cliff or whatever, people preferred to jump off the cliff than rather deal with the recommendations, my recollection. So that's encouraging to know that you think there's potentially a pathway to get more traction outside the committee, maybe for votes on the floor of each chamber. It's interesting here because you not only are working these policy issues and just reference the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, which I think is doing super important work and having important conversations, but you're also vice chair of the Republican Conference, which is, I guess, fairly new. It succeeded now Speaker Johnson, who held that position before becoming Speaker. How do you balance kind of these sorts of interests that make good policy sense but don't make good political sense from the standpoint of you get punished for it in your role as a vice chair of conference, which of course is part of the Republican leadership?
Just be honest with your constituents. Just be forthright, and don't just play a political narrative. Go and actually tell them the reality, right? And it's not like I'm calling out people being dishonest. There is plenty of that in politics nowadays. Right. But it's taking a narrative and spinning it in a way that benefits whatever you're trying to kind of, communicate, I'll say. I just, I go back to the district and explain things. Why in the world would I vote for an appropriations bill? Well, you fundamentally misunderstand that if I don't vote in favor of it and Speaker Johnson's leading this effort, then we don't get the spending cuts associated with it. So if you want me to actually find a way to reduce spending, then we have to be willing to vote in favor of things. Just sitting back, voting no, kind of hoping yes, it's become too popular in Congress nowadays, and that's not what leadership truly is, in my opinion. Is you have to go out, you have to do tough things. The things that face our nation, ironically, are very similar to what we saw in the late 70s inflation out of control, turmoil across the globe, and candidly, we need a Reagan-esque type of leader to become and do this. And he had hard things he had to overcome. It wasn't easy for him to sit down with Tip O'Neill. They had a great relationship, but it wasn't easy to sit down and come to that level of compromise. We have to be willing to do the hard stuff and then just go explain it and go. And you survive. You can survive anything if you're just honest and transparent with people.
Well, I think the Vote No, Hope Yes caucus has certainly seen an increase in the Republican conference. Certainly when President Biden, during the Biden administration, we'll see what happens next. That will shift, I would think, markedly, should it be President Trump in office come January 2025. One of the things that you've done in the Ways and Means Committee, which I referenced at the outset, but I want to jump into a little bit here, is kind of use that national security and foreign policy interests and advanced it in the Ways and Means Committee. And here I'm referring to focusing on China, because so much of the national security challenges we face from communist China not only are presented by traditional national security and defense threats, but they're economic in nature. One that stood out to me was legislation introduced that was deterring economic aggression through retaliation, the Deter Act. Well done to you or your team member that gave you the great acronym for legislation there. It's always worthy of a prize, and I think in a congressional office when you get a good name like that. But that's really going after China's status as their kind of permanent normal trade relations status. Talk about that and specifically the Deter Act more broadly. And I know you recently attended an event where you were with some experts, Matt Pottinger, I think former Deputy National Security Advisor with the Trump administration, talking about China issues, but how China plays not only in the realm of, let's say, an Armed Services Committee in the Pentagon, but actually in the Ways and Means Committee as you think about American economic policy.
Yeah, I was thrilled to be able to kind of co-lead this bicameral effort. Senator Langford, it's very simple. We can look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and say, what can we do differently to help avoid this calamity in the South Pacific? I take an example of Utah. There's very, very, very few Russian goods coming into Utah that even needed to be on the sanction list once things, inflamed, and once Russia made their invasion attempt. Like, the economic integration becomes so apparent, the lack thereof there in Russia, in U.S. relations, we don't rely on them for as much. Other nations and other allied nations do, but that's getting into energy policy.
Right.
The economic integration we have with China and Taiwan are far and away more catastrophic, but also influential to help avoid something. So we want to do as much deterring as possible. Like, put these measures out there early. If you do X, Y is going to happen. And that Y is really bad for you. If China's no longer on the preferred nation, so preferred normal trade relations, that's a big hit to their economy, and that might be the only place to really deter them. And so,
for those not familiar with that status and kind of what it means in terms of global trade and trading with the United States, and kind of how would it be impacted? And I guess the flip side of it, given that we have such a robust trade relationship with China, right? Right after the EU is China, right? Then it's going to hurt us as well, or that we'll become victim to it as well, which is part of the conundrum as we think about decoupling and separation.
Yeah, and so just a couple quick things. In '99, under President Clinton, we allowed China to enter into the World Trade Organization as a full-time member, but PNTR, Preferred Nation Trade Relations, it gives them access to lower tariffs. It gives them access to the U.S. market, things that are very beneficial to both sides, but they definitely would hurt China. We had to revoke that with Russia after this conflict, and just trying to get out ahead of it. So it's another way, and it's an economic way to hopefully make Taiwan as prickly as possible for any potential conflict there.
What you referenced Ukraine, and of course, over the past year, one of the big battles in the Congress and the Republican conference in the House was funding for Ukraine. The United States has given over $100 billion in aid. Speaker Johnson ultimately pushed through the measure, and relying on Democratic votes as well as Republican votes, but not a majority of Republicans got that through, and it's had a material impact on President Zelensky and Ukraine's ability to repel Russian aggression. It's a battle that the line seems to be changing on a daily basis, and momentum shifts from one side to the other, but there's no doubt absent U.S. security assistance, military support, Ukraine would not have been able to defend its sovereign territory, and the free people of Ukraine would no longer be free. You, of course, supported that measure, and it was politically fraught for Republicans at the time. Although, if you listen to Speaker Johnson as he reflects on it, he said that Republicans who supported the measure have not seen any political fallout for it, and he's only received support for it. That's something he said maybe a few months ago, but I think it still holds true. Congressman Moore, give us your take on Ukraine and U.S. support for Ukraine, and the prospect of the United States being able to continue to support Ukraine in the form of military assistance.
Absolutely. There's a couple of key aspects here, and I don't want to be remiss by not mentioning how proud I was of Speaker Johnson for navigating all that. This was not an easy issue. Our border got tied into it, and we couldn't even advance all of our initiatives because we had too many folks, not willing to vote yes on something. We could have gotten some of this leverage from, making sure that our border was more secure. That became part of the really difficult aspect of this. It wasn't necessarily supporting Ukraine, but it was more, we have so many issues at our own border, why can't we do it? Well, we can't be unified as 218 Republicans to go and support some piece of leverage against the Biden administration on the border, and it's tough. So Speaker Johnson was navigating all this, and I saw him stand up there and say, I do not care how this affects the trajectory of me as a speaker. I wasn't trying to be speaker, but I believe this is the right thing. And that was Reagan-esque, in my opinion. And I don't want to, draw any conclusions or comparisons that don't need to be. But I did. I really believe that. I know that he sees the value of strong allies, and Ukraine's willing to fight for themselves. And at the same time, the reason why I don't think we're taking as much political heat for it is, like, everybody admits this cannot be an endless war.
Right.
And so we've been able to deter and keep Russia from invading Kyiv. Ukraine's been bolstered in certain areas here or there, but going forward, this is, we've got to be able to change the calculus over there. And things like the REPO Act, being able to leverage Russian seized assets to help rebuild Ukraine and repay some of the Western, either the Europeans or the U.S. and some version of Japan and some other allies. Like, all that stuff is got good positive trajectory. We're spending less than 0.2% of our GDP decimating Russia's military, completely putting them in a very difficult, embarrassing situation, and supporting an ally. Like, it's been a good use of money. It is expensive, but it's been a good use of money.
It's certainly cheaper than if Vladimir Putin were to succeed. He would be more ambitious. His appetite would only grow and would seek to attack a NATO ally, and then the U.S. Would be presented with a really tough decision as that would be far more consequential than, as you just noted, the funds we put in, and really the U.S. equipment. We're not giving them money directly. We're giving them U.S. equipment to fight against Russia. And you're right, they've depleted the Russian military. Hundreds of thousands have died or injured, and now they're relying on North Korean military.
North Korean military to come in and North Korean troops. If you have to get to the point of you're relying on North Korean troops, you've suffered some losses. And like you said, this is, we had good intelligence on when they would invade. We also know his intentions and Putin's intentions. This doesn't just end at Ukraine. And hopefully we never have to encounter or try to prove that. And hopefully we can find a way to shore up Ukraine, create, I don't know if it ends up being like a South Korea type of operation where we just provide, make sure that they've got security backing, but also allow them to have their borders, whatever that may be, and move forward. We've got to get to that point. We need strong leadership in the White House to be able to get.
Well, we'll see. President Trump has promised that he'll solve this if he's elected before Inauguration Day. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I hope it accrues to the benefit of the free people of Ukraine and repels Russian aggression and presence in the sovereign territory of Ukraine. I guess that's a bit of a TBD. You did mention, just as you were talking about, one of the concerns, reasonable concerns, I think Republicans have. They're often pitted security assistance support for Ukraine, American taxpayer dollars going to provide military equipment to Ukraine against American dollars for our own border. So why are we protecting the sovereign territory of Ukraine instead of the sovereign territory of the United States? I think you and I view that as an and, not an or. Right. You can do both. But one of the things that you just referenced is this REPO Act, which, again, would provide a pathway to take possession of Russian dollars. I think there's probably, over $5 billion available for taking, perhaps more. And it's already started. Some of that funds, it's a modest amount, maybe $5 million plus, that has been repossessed and now used and could go towards either paying back those who've given money to Ukraine on loan or to rebuilding Ukraine at the appropriate time. That REPO Act legislation went through with the security assistance funding. Is that correct?
Correct. And what you're seeing, the vast majority of this, and there's talk of $300 billion worth of frozen assets, Russian frozen assets, largely existing in Europe. So European Union is moving the needle on this as well and creating some potential loan restructuring of assistance that's either been done or likely will be done. And you can take from that. That to me should be one of Putin's biggest deterrents, is more of these frozen funds being used against yourself and reinvigorating Ukraine. That seems to have very broad support, at least for me back home, once I explain the reality of that. It's not the majority of the funding that we've provided,
right,
but we've been able to at least inch our way towards it. And I think there's more potential down the road.
And that sort of thing I definitely think it speaks to the critics. And the other is that the Europeans should do more. And I think in this respect, the pushback from the Republicans has been positive. We've seen an increase of funding coming from Europe. The United States gives the military support. The Europeans can do other types of aid, and that's knocking over north of 80 billion, perhaps more than that. And so we're approaching parity of this problem. I think it's a reasonable critique that Europeans should give as much, if not more, for security in their continent than the United States.
And it's not just the Ukraine aid. It's actually money being invested into NATO. And
yep.
So it has been a good, and it's something that I very much agree with President Trump on, is we want to make sure these folks pay their fair share. 2% is supposed to be spent on defense and everything NATO. We're not going to get taken advantage of as a country. We need them to be able to do that. This created a catalyst for us to communicate, hey, we're serious. You got to up your own NATO and your own defense presence. Plus, let's get on parity with supporting Ukraine. Now, a lot of their money goes into the humanitarian side, and we're going more to the lethal force side, the lethal aid. That's great, and we need to make sure. And I've seen a lot from my party misconstruing that information. Europe has done more than we give them credit for,
right?
And that's unfortunate that we.
Well, their humanitarian aid certainly. I mean, that's almost all of the $80+ billion they've given in the United States. The humanitarian side is as you know, is far more limited. I think it's roughly about 30 billion, perhaps less. Yeah. We're coming towards the end of our conversation with Congressman Blake Moore right here, having a conversation just ahead of Election Day. How about, given your perch in the Republican leadership, prospects for holding on to the majority? How are you feeling here just a few days before Election Day? Do we see results here with the Republicans holding on to the gavel?
Yeah, I'm confident that the House Republicans will hold on to a slim majority. I think gone are the days of the Tip O'Neill type of majorities that he had back when Reagan had to work with him across the aisle so much. We're seeing very narrow majorities. So, a 7 to 8 seat majority, that's an uptick from what we had in the 118th Congress. It would be welcome. And you're going to see this play out. You get more seats out of North Carolina. You might lose a couple in the South. California and New York are really big battleground states. So without going into all the specific polling that I'm seeing, And I do see us hanging on to a narrow majority, keeping the gavels in the right hands. Senate seems to most likely going to flip. At a minimum, it's 50-50. So it depends on who the vice president is. And, you know, it's funny. There's like all sorts of like Vegas is now getting involved in presidential elections.
Yes.
I don't think it's a good thing for our nation, but they're a better predictor sometimes than, you know, the way that they could set a line of like 2.5 when somebody wins by a field goal is beyond me. But yeah, I mean, the scales get tipped towards Trump. Right when Vice President Harris kind of came into the scene, she had a big of a sugar high. I think that's worn off. And people just want economic and global security, and they see the former President Trump as a better option for that.
So if I'm piecing that together, not that you're in the business of making predictions, I asked you, it sounded like Republicans hold the majority by Harris, 7 to 8 seats. Republicans could get a majority, but you're thinking at least 50-50. And then President Trump could find himself back in the Oval Office, which would be a trifecta for Republicans, effectively giving the House the majority in the Senate. Of course, we reference the House, and then holding the White House. That would be quite a significant election outcome.
Yeah, and I think we probably get a couple more on the margins in the Senate. You could get Montana. So if I were to actually put the numbers on it, I would say we have a 7-seat majority in the House, 52-48 in the Senate, and the White House. But there's no betting odds on those ones. Those are just the ones that I'm coming up with.
Well, if that plays out, we'll have you back on, because you'll be in the business of writing legislation and beyond writing, passing legislation.
2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires the end of 2025.
That's a big year in 2025.
That was passed initially on party line vote, just Republicans only. And in order to re-extend it and not have a massive tax increase on American families and workers, we would need to get to work very quickly on making sure that we extend some of that type of stuff. And you know, all this exists. If you go back and look at you know, the Reagan doctrine. You talk about a strong defense, but you talk about a stronger private sector and making sure that we're doing less at the federal government. He communicated it so brilliantly. You know, probably my very favorite thing that you ever hear from him wasn't even during his own election. It was the time for choosing, which pretty much put him on stage. But that, if you go back and look at that, it's just an amazing.
Well, you've jumped to our lightning round, and then I was going to ask you what your favorite Reagan speech was, and it sounds like it's a time for choosing. So you anticipated, they just had this, it was just the 60th anniversary of that speech, because it was a speech, as you know, was given in support of Barry Goldwater's campaign, and then the line, I believe, is attributed to George Will, said he was successful in electing Barry Goldwater. Just took him 16 years longer when he came into office in 1980. But tell us about what speaks to you about the time for choosing speech.
Well, there's a part in that well, overall, I was born in 1980, so my mom always called me a Reagan baby. It was clearly her favorite president because he was so engaging and he was so willing to just be the great communicator that he is. It set him up on stage. He then becomes governor, and again, that's what it was. But it just talked about we cannot solve these problems from the federal government. We have to empower the American people, right? That's a premise for, I think, anything that he ever put out there, you know. And it kind of, you can see remnants of that start. It was a common thread through his entire time in his political leadership. But you know, the American people are where the problem should exist, and it doesn't come from government. It's a function of our Constitution, but it's not where we need to be solving so many problems. And I was a
big advocate of we the people and taking it to the American people. Congressman Blake Moore, thank you so much for joining the show. And I think we're going to have you back, if you're willing, in 2025 as you're tackling all of those policy issues you just outlined, particularly tax policy out of the Ways and Means Committee.
I'd be honored.
Take care. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.